Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 136, Mrs. Livesey, Part 2. I'm starting this episode lifting off where we had Mrs. Livesey decide that she was going to do a cinema film to protest her innocence, and now she's arrived in Adelaide facing charges. There was a provisional warrant for the arrest of Mrs. Florence Elizabeth Gardner, alias Judith Anderson, alias Stevens Lockwood, and on the 23rd of February 1946 it detailed the case over in Adelaide at the Supreme Criminal Sittings. Mrs. Livesey released on bond. His Honour yesterday released the 47-year-old Sydney woman, known as Mrs. Ethel Livesey, under a bond of 2 charges of false pretences. The bond was for £300, with a surety of £300 to be of good behaviour for 3 years and to notify the police of her address or change of address whenever she might be in South Australia in that period. The defendant was charged under the name of Florence Elizabeth Ethel Gardner and was found guilty by a majority of the jury on Thursday of 2 charges: that at Henley Beach she obtained goods with false pretences, and that at Adelaide in September 1933 she obtained goods valued at £13 from Oakey Cafes Limited by false pretences. Mr. Chamberlain informed His Honour that the defendant had 2 previous convictions, and she also had a third in the name of Gloria Gray for false pretences in Melbourne in June 1934, for which she was sentenced to 6 months' jail. His Honour said that he was not clear what the defendant's name really was. In these proceedings, she had been shown to have used the names of Gray, Gardner and Anderson. And at that point, a young man in the gallery called out and said, "That's the name." His Honour said, "Remove anyone who makes a noise, Sergeant." Police then ejected the young man, who subsequently told the police he was Frank George Anderson, 21 years old, married, of Queenstown, and was the son of the woman in the dock. Continuing, His Honour referred to other names which the defendant had used at various times, including Swindle and Pollard. In the present case, His Honour said the charges could have been disposed of summarily in November 1933 had the defendant herself chosen, as she was entitled to be tried by a jury. Over 12 years had elapsed since the offences. Her past record was not clear. He had no information as to where she had been since 1934, but there was nothing to indicate any infraction of the criminal law, and he accepted her record as clear since then. He said these offences are serious. Preying on the community by fraud must be suppressed. You are getting on in years and your state of health is serious. You have ability and astuteness, undoubtedly, but I think you may also have an extreme form of egotism. He decided it was not necessary to impose imprisonment at present, that if she behaved herself for 3 years, and ordered rectification to the police in case she ever came to South Australia in that period. And then on the 1st of June 1946, Mrs. Livesey not now in Adelaide. Inquiries in Adelaide today for Mrs. Ethel Livesey, whose estate was sequestrated in the Federal Bankruptcy Court in Sydney yesterday, revealed that she left here a week ago for Melbourne. During the hearing of the case in Sydney, Mrs. Livesey's solicitor said she was in bad health and sought an adjournment to obtain proper instructions from his client, who was in Adelaide. Mrs. Livesey had been staying here with one of her sons, but left for Melbourne last Saturday to stay with friends. The petitioning creditor in her bankruptcy case was Ivan Sinclair, trading as household supply of Double Bay, and he alleged that a Supreme Court debt of £149 was still unpaid. It says on the 20th of July 1946, from information gained in Adelaide today, it appears likely she's in Victoria. When she left here about 2 months ago, she told her 20-year-old son, with whom she'd been staying, that she was going to live at Kingsville, a suburb of Melbourne. But then another report said that there was an order for a warrant to search the premises of McNeil Brothers at Wearing, Victoria, for the property of Mrs. Livesey, which was stated to be in a locked room there. It's alleged that she accepted a position of housekeeper there, but left to go to Melbourne. Mrs. Livesey's statement of assets show real estate at Liverpool valued at £1,250 and £20 cash in hand. On the 20th of August 1946, it said Mrs. Livesey is now employed as a domestic in Perth, and she denied in an affidavit an allegation by the official receiver in Sydney, Mr. A.V. Richardson, that she had, in about July 1945, withdrawn £40,000 from the Isle of Man Bank Limited. She stated that the only money she had withdrawn from that or any other bank was no more than £4,000. She had no money to maintain herself and had to do domestic work in order to keep herself. She had obtained domestic work in Melbourne, but had lost her employment because of the notoriety attached to her. She was satisfied that she would be unable to obtain employment in any of the eastern states. She therefore had gone to Western Australia, where she arrived on July the 27th. However, by February 1947, it stated that Mrs. Livesey was now living at Victoria Palace in Melbourne. And then in the Launceston Examiner in Tasmania on the 23rd of February 1950, Mrs. Livesey conducts her own defence at trial. Spirited verbal encounters between Nan Glover, otherwise Ethel Livesey, and the two main witnesses for the Crown were a feature of the first day of the trial at Launceston yesterday of Mrs. Livesey on 6 charges of obtaining money by false pretences. Mrs. Glover had been extradited from Queensland. Mrs. Livesey, who pled not guilty, was not represented by counsel and conducted her own defence. She is charged with having obtained from William Henry Hammersley a total of £550 with the intent to defraud. Hammersley, now of Bangor, first met Mrs. Livesey in June 1947, said Mr. Chambers. In response to a telegram from her, he again met Mrs. Livesey at the Criterion Hotel Launceston on the 13th of February 1948. It was then that what the Crown called a series of false pretences began. Mrs. Livesey had told Hammersley that she was married to his cousin, Alfred Glover, and that Glover had confiscated 2 cheques in their joint account for £5,000 at the ES&A Bank. She also said that Glover had contracted debts before their marriage and she wanted money to pay them, whereas the truth was she'd never married Glover. Mrs. Livesey told Hammersley that she needed about £100 to square the alleged debts, and believing her, Hammersley gave her that amount in notes. On the 20th of February, Mr. Chambers said that Mrs. Livesey saw Hammersley again and saying that the £100 had been insufficient to pay the debts and obtained a further £50 from him. On each occasion, she emphasised the so-called marriage and the alleged joint account. On the 9th of March, Mrs. Livesey informed Hammersley that her father and brother were arriving from England and she needed money to buy furniture, as her father was elderly and she wanted to make him comfortable with complete rest. She said Glover still refused to sign cheques. Hammersley lent her another £100, making it up to that stage at £250. She subsequently received further sums of £100, £50 and £150, the final amount. Details that she obtained £50 from Mr. Hammersley to provide a reception for her brother in Hobart. Hammersley said the first time Glover had mentioned that she was not married to Alfred Glover was when she told him that Alfred Glover had cleared out after he had given her the last £150. She told Hammersley, being for liquidation of her liabilities for an electric stove and equipment for a cake shop business that she was then selling at Sandy Beach. After Hammersley had detailed the circumstances of the advances and told of his unsuccessful efforts to regain his money, Mrs. Livesey described Hammersley's information as stuff and nonsense and deliberate lies. During a heated passage, Mrs. Livesey declared, "This is absolutely a frame-up, as I can prove." Hammersley said it was correct that Mrs. Livesey had come to him with a bruised face and had admitted that Glover had struck her. Mrs. Livesey said, "Did I say I need not stay with him any longer as I am not married to him?" Hammersley said, "That is not true. You first told me you were not married when you came and said that Glover had cleared out." She said, "Don't you think if I had said what you say, you would have gone to Glover and asked him why he didn't pay his debts? I was very ill at the time and not able to get about very well. On being told by Mrs. Glover that Glover was ill-treating her, I tried to contact Glover by letter asking him to see me. I wrote 3 letters and he failed to come. Later he told me he never received the letters." "This is all rubbish," declared Hammersley when further questioned by Mrs. Livesey. Mrs. Livesey said, "I'm speaking the truth," and Hammersley said, "You never speak the truth, unfortunately. I suggest that you never had the receipt you say I gave you and got back. That's a filthy lie." "Was Glover certainly on your side about the money?" And he said yes. He was eventually trying to get it back for me. Mrs. Livesey said, "You've told an awful lot of lies. You say I sold the Sandy Bay business to you. I deny that." And he said, "Naturally, you would." Mrs. Livesey, referring to the final negotiations between her, Hammersley Glover, and Mr. Gee, her solicitor, said to Hammersley, "You kept me dangling on a string. Mr. Gee asked you if you would accept £10 a week, and you wouldn't say whether you would do this or go to the police." Hammersley said, "I finally agreed to accept £10 a week and the balance when the £500 for which you said you'd cabled to England had arrived." Hammersley said he tried to contact Glover personally but failed for the reasons he discovered later. At the time, he naturally concluded that Glover was trying to avoid him, that Glover was upset about what had happened and did not want to face him. Hammersley said it was only when Glover turned up to meet him at the Brisbane hotel instead of Mrs. Glover, who had made the appointment, that he learnt that the joint bank account did not exist. Hammersley said that he also received telegrams purporting to come from Mrs. Glover's brother. Her tale was always so good, he said, explaining why he believed her for so long. Hammersley said Mrs. Livesey had represented herself as a wealthy woman, stating she had £5,000 in a joint account, money in a fixed deposit in Western Australia, and that her father was a well-off retired cotton manufacturer in England and her brother a brain specialist. The witness never saw the father or brothers, who were supposed to be coming to Tasmania. They were fictitious. And His Honour asked, "Any idea where the money you gave Mrs. Livesey went?" And Hammersley said no. She didn't seem to live extravagantly. She used to fly around in taxis and that sort of thing. Anyhow, I thought she was wealthy and accustomed to spending money, with a few hundreds being nothing to her. I thought the woman was really honest and that it was only a matter of time and she would pay me. I thought that if I could help her, I should. His Honour asked, "You are not wealthy?" And Hammersley said, "I certainly am not." Hammersley also said he had not known that she was Mrs. Livesey until this September. Alfred Glover, now of Tunnel, labourer, told of having met Mrs. Livesey as Mrs. Stafford at her flat in Tamar Street in June 1947. He engaged her as his housekeeper. Glover said that he was farming at Corolla and she was there with him for 8 or 9 months, and then they decided to move to Sandy Beach. She was then known as Mrs. Glover and decided to buy a business in his name as she was bankrupt. Later, he and Mrs. Livesey lived as man and wife, but they were never married. She used the name of Glover. Mrs. Livesey told him that she was wealthy and would place £5,000 in a joint bank account when it came from Perth in Western Australia. No money ever came and there was never any joint account. Mrs. Livesey bought the cake shop business at Sandy Beach in his name, but she conducted it. The witness put £80 into the business and went there on living at Corolla. He did not know what money Mrs. Livesey made from the business. He never got any. Hammersley said he mentioned to Mrs. Glover that he was looking for a business, and in May 1948 she told him she had a business for sale at Sandy Beach. He looked over the business with his housekeeper, Mrs. Rowbottom, and told Mrs. Glover he was prepared to take it and allow her £300 from £400 he lent her to that date. While living at Sandy Beach in May 1948, Glover said Mrs. Livesey first told him she owed Hammersley £600. She asked him to use his influence as his cousin to stop Hammersley going to the police, and he said he would try. Saw a receipt for £250 made out by Mrs. Glover in favour of Hammersley. She said she got it to show the bank how much she owed Hammersley, and she asked him to burn it. She sent a telegram making an appointment with Hammersley in Launceston, but asked the witness to keep it instead. She suggested that if Hammersley asked if there was a joint account for £500 that he should say yes, and that he would get his money if he waited a while. The witness kept that appointment. Hammersley went to the Sandy Beach the next day and was annoyed about the lies Mrs. Livesey had told him about the joint account. Later, Mrs. Livesey said she would receive money from her estate in England and pay Hammersley by the 15th of October. "Did she mention amounts?" asked Mr. Chambers, and Glover, laughing ironically, said yes, big amounts. At one stage I was to benefit by £27,000. After a time, the accused disclosed to Glover that she was Mrs. Livesey. The couple parted in about September 1948. And when he met her in Launceston again, in response to her telegram, she wanted him to marry her, but he said he would not until Hammersley got his money. At a conference with her solicitor, who said that as she had not any money, all Hammersley could do was send her to jail, the witness had said that was her place, instead of dragging people down to the level of a blackfellow. She drove off in a car she'd hired, not even saying goodbye. Glover said he never confiscated any cheques and he never had any debts. His bills were always paid regularly. To Mrs. Livesey, Glover said he'd raised his hand to her twice while they were together. Once he hit her on the chin and on another occasion turned her over his knee and smacked her hard. He said to the accused, "And you got let down lightly, lighter than you let down my pocket." Glover denied knocking Mrs. Livesey down flat on the floor. He said he had given her a diamond engagement ring, but not an engagement party. Glover told Mrs. Livesey that she had informed him that her brother was coming with power of attorney and he would get £27,000 and a possible £50,000 when her father died. Mrs. Livesey in response said that's absolute rubbish. Glover admitted that he had served a sentence once before for causing grievous bodily harm to two men. From the sale of the Sandy Beach business, Glover said he got £250, not £300. "And you were to pay all the accounts," he told Mrs. Livesey, "and you left them unpaid." Mrs. Livesey asked who paid the butcher, and Glover said, "Poor little me." After a duel between Mrs. Livesey and Glover had brought repeated laughter in the court, Mrs. Livesey appealed to the judge and also accused Glover of trying to be funny, which he denied. To Mr. Chambers, he said that when he struck Mrs. Livesey in the face after a quarrel because he had taken some of his own money from her bag to pay bills, she held one leg of his trousers, pulling hard, and he held the other, and he thought they would split in the tussle, so he gave her a series of short jabs until she let go. The accountant at the ES&A Bank in Launceston said there was no joint account for £5,000 at the bank in the name of Nan or Ethel Glover and Alfred Glover between January 1947 and May 1948. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty after a retirement of an hour and a half, and Mrs. Livesey was discharged. 9 months later, in the Adelaide News, on the 29th of November 1950, there is an article titled "Widow on 3 charges." A well-known Sydney widow, now living in Adelaide, was charged in the Adelaide Police Court today with 3 offences that had been committed here in 1946. She was Florence Elizabeth Ethel Livesey, 53, a domestic of McGill. It was alleged that between the 9th of October and the 6th of November 1946 at Lower North Adelaide, she stole a quantity of crystalware, glassware, clothing and table linen valued at £6, the property of Jonathan Morris Powell, and a pair of rubber boots worth 10 shillings belonging to Gladys Alice Powell. The allegations were that on the 31st of October 1946 she obtained £2 and 5 shillings from Rosalind Christina Tredrea, a city second-hand dealer, by falsely pretending that she was Mrs. E. Morris living at Fitzroy Terrace, Prospect, and the owner of certain property that she was offering for sale. Also, on the 6th of November 1946, she obtained a further £4 from Mrs. Tredrea by falsely pretending that she was Mrs. Morris and living at Port Elliot and that the property she was offering for sale belonged to her mother, since deceased. At the time of the alleged offences, Livesey was employed as a housekeeper by Powell at Kingston Terrace in Lower North Adelaide under the name of Mrs. Nelson. While Livesey was employed there, Powell's wife died, and he gave Livesey permission to distribute some of his wife's clothing to charity. After Livesey left his employ in November 1946, Powell discovered that the property mentioned in the larceny charge was missing. Police until recently had been unable to locate Livesey. When questioned, she claimed she was living in Sydney at the time of the alleged offences. And another article stated that she was remanded for sentence on a 4-year-old charge of theft, and she was ordered to 2 months' jail. She admitted that she had stolen the crystalware and glassware, the property of Jonathan Morris Powell, and a pair of rubber boots. Livesey had a number of previous convictions, including offences for false pretences in England, Victoria and Adelaide. In January 1951, upon her release, there was a £300 bond placed on Florence, and he also entreated a surety for a similar amount against Sylvia Sidonia Anderson of Flinders Park. And on the 8th of March 1951, it mentions that Florence Elizabeth Ethel Livesey of King's Cross, Sydney, lately residing at Gowrie Gate, Potts Point. That was in relation to a bankruptcy. Only a fortnight later, in Adelaide, Mrs. Livesey again. Florence Elizabeth Ethel Gardner, otherwise known as Livesey, had forfeited £300 for having broken a bond. The money had been paid into the Sheriff's Office. Sylvia Hedonia Anderson of Mulbrook Road, Flinders Park, daughter-in-law of Mrs. Livesey, was then called upon to show why she should not be required to pay a £300 surety. Mrs. J.D. O'Sullivan for Mrs. Anderson said that she went surety for Livesey, who entered into a bond to be of good behaviour for 3 years on an admittance of a false pretences charge on the 22nd of February 1946. Mrs. Livesey broke her bond before the 3 years expired. The court reduced the amount to be paid by Mrs. Anderson to £50. Florence, under the name of Florence Elizabeth Ethel Carradine, married Stephen George Tizard, husband number 9, in Victoria in 1951. Stephen Tizard was recorded as living at Maryborough in Victoria in 1949 as a painter. His wife, Ruby, died in February 1950. And Florence died under the name of Florence Elizabeth Ethel Tizard at Heidelberg in Victoria in 1959. The age recorded on the death certificate was 54. She was in fact 62, and her parents were mentioned as Gertrude and Frank Gwindles. A little on her 2 boys. Her first child that survived was Frank George Anderson, and he was born on the 12th of October 1923 in Dublin, but his military papers says he was born in Wales on the 12th of October 1924, but that would have been to allow him to be 18 years old to enlist. Frank's descendants said that he talked about his mother, but he was very bitter about her abandonment of him as a child. When he enlisted in World War II at Wayville, South Australia, on the 11th of December 1942, he was an unemployed labourer, and he listed his brother as his next of kin, stating his usual address was at Hindmarsh, South Australia, at his brother's residence at the time of his enlistment. Frank was discharged because he had been sentenced. Frank had actually been sentenced in Adelaide for forging and uttering, and it starts to be a little bit of a story that mirrors his mother in some ways. The article on the 12th of October 1943 says remanded on forgery charges. On 2 charges of forging and uttering, Frank George Anderson, 19, soldier of Wayville, was remanded. It was alleged that on June the 4th in Adelaide, with the intent to defraud, Anderson forged and uttered a cheque for £2 drawn on the National Bank of Australia Asia, and on the same day at Hindmarsh forged and uttered a cheque of a similar amount on the same bank. The police prosecutor said another charge, one of breaking and entering, would be preferred against Anderson. It was alleged he and another man broke into a city office and stole a number of cheque forms. Frank married Teresa May Fitzpatrick, known as Florence, in Perth in 1944 when she was 17 and Frank was 20. At the time of their marriage, he was a seaman in the American Merchant Marines. On the 26th of March 1945, he was jailed for theft. In the Port Adelaide Police Court today, Frank George Anderson of Lipson Street, Port Adelaide, was ordered 1 month's jail for having, on or about the March the 20th, stolen a shirt belonging to Ronald Thomas Kimpton. In July 1945, Frank and Teresa had a daughter, Margaret Teresa Anderson, in South Australia. Margaret had a daughter before she married Lloyd Harrison with Leo Triffett. She also had 2 sons, Graham and Robert, with Lloyd Harrison, then married Bob Dearden and had a son, Anthony, and then married Gary Barnes and had no children. She then remarried her first husband, Lloyd Harrison. Frank and Teresa's daughter Margaret died in Adelaide on the 20th of February 2021, aged 75. In an article in relation to Florence Elizabeth Ethel Gardner, as she was named at the time, it says, Mr Justice Mayer began to announce his decision and mentioned that it was not clear whether her name was Gardner or Anderson. A man in the public gallery said Anderson is her name. The judge instructed the police to remove the interjector, but outside the court, the man told police his name was Frank George Anderson and he claimed he was the son of Mrs Livesey and he was 21. On the 12th of September 1946, Florence May Anderson of Margaret Street, Rosewater, put in a divorce proceeding against Frank George Anderson of Long Street, Queenstown, on the grounds of adultery with Rhonda Walker of Long Street, Queenstown. On the 10th of December 1949, it says a man who yesterday brought his family to Sydney from Adelaide because he'd heard there were more houses here is now homeless. Frank George Anderson, 25, a returned serviceman, with his wife and 4 children, the oldest 4 and the youngest only 9 weeks old, was evicted this week from a shop dwelling he occupied in Port Adelaide for 3 years. He said he could not go to his mother-in-law's place because it would soon be demolished, so decided to come to Sydney. Last night, the Anderson family was accommodated by the Travellers' Aid Society. They must have returned to Adelaide as on the 6th of September 1950, There's an article that states that 3 men were fined over two-up. As a result of a police raid on a two-up school at Port Adelaide, 3 men were fined. Frank George Anderson, a waterside worker of Long Street, Queenstown, was fined £2 10 shillings with 10 shillings costs for having been present at the game. On the 23rd of May 1951, Frank George Anderson, 27 of Pembroke Street, Draper, denied in the Port Adelaide court today that on the 18th of April he was unlawfully in possession at Port Adelaide of 2 wristlet watches suspected of having been stolen. He told the court he bought one of the watches for £16 about 18 months ago when he was on holiday in Sydney, and he decided in April to sell it, and another one for another man. And then on the 30th of July 1951, Frank George Anderson of Pembroke Street, Draper, was fined £70 with £3 2 shillings costs for having smuggled 30 imitation pearl necklaces and 6 cigarette lighters from the Eastern Saga ship on the 1st of May. The prosecutor from the Customs Department said that when questioned at Blanchetown about the smuggled necklaces, Anderson denied the offence. However, suspicions that he had got rid of the contraband goods when his car lights went out as the vehicle swerved were borne out. A necklace was later found alongside the road. So it seems possibly the proceedings of the divorce didn't happen, as Frank had children with June Silky Dello, who had previously been married to Patrick James Webb Boland. Patrick Boland died in 1954 in Warwick in Queensland. He committed suicide. June and Patrick had 4 children together, and when Frank began a relationship with June, he changed his name to June's married name. So he became Frank Boland. It's very interesting, mirroring the change of name like his mother did many, many times. June was a year older than Frank, and there is no evidence that they formally married, quite likely because I don't think the divorce proceedings went through with his first wife. Based on Frank and June's graves in Tilba, New South Wales, they had 5 children together: Corinne, Louita, Juen, Sydney and Brick. Frank died on the 23rd of October 2005 at the age of 82 under the name Frank George Boland. And Florence's second surviving child was Basil William Dwight Anderson. He was born on the 15th of December 1925 at Wandsworth, Greater London, but his military file says he was born in Manchester. He enlisted in World War II in Adelaide, and he was a squadron leader in the RAAF. He listed his brother Frank as his next of kin when he enlisted, and he married Sylvia Sidonia Schultz in Adelaide on the 11th of May 1946, when he was 20 and Sylvia 28. Sylvia had previously been married. On the 17th of May 1945, it mentions William Richard Cook of Lahunty Street, Kilburn, against Sylvia Sidonia Cook of Holbrook Road, Flinders Park, on the grounds of adultery with Basil William Anderson of Holbrook Road, Flinders Park. So Sylvia's previous marriage ended in divorce due to being in an adulterous relationship with Basil. They had 3 children together, and Basil died on the 25th of September 2010 at Flinders Park, South Australia, at the age of 84. And then it mentions about when it was time for entering into the bond, an attractive young woman, Mrs. Sylvia Anderson, a daughter-in-law of the woman, stepped forward. She put out a hand which was clasped by her mother-in-law, and the two stood hand in hand as the terms of the bond were read out. So it seems there was a shred of truth in all of Florence's aliases and all of the husbands and lies that she told, that it does seem that when she spoke about her sons, that she was accurate. Her sons did seem to have a form of relationship with her, quite likely on and off throughout her life. She seemed to go back to them when she was in trouble, being in Adelaide at least 3 times in her time in Australia. So, the very convoluted life of Florence Elizabeth Ethel Swindles.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.